And I'd just like to give an extra special thank you to my Asbantium level patrons, Chris Douglas, Fallon Cortez, and Jamie Ashton. Thank you so much for your support. What happens when you get your hair cut? You go in, you sit down, then for however long you're getting it cut, you have a little chat with your barber or your hairdresser. After all, what else are you gonna do? Sit there in silence, awkwardly staring at yourself in the mirror like I did for years? So you sit there, you chat about football, your holidays, your work, you tell a story. So Doctor Who's The Story in the Engine asks the question, what if barbershop stories were life or death? After all, barbers collect just as many stories as church confessionals. The Story in the Engine is all about the Doctor getting trapped in a barbershop which feeds on stories to fuel a machine. Hence the title. It's an episode about culture, false gods, and magical regrowing hair. But is it good? Well, as always, that's what I'm here to find out. So take a seat in the barber's chair and buckle up, because without any further ado, it's time to take a look at The Story in the Engine. Something interesting to know about this episode is how it has an exclusive online prequel story tie-in, which Doctor Who episodes haven't had for quite a while now, and it's a good return to using different media platforms to deepen stories. The short story in question introduces us to Omo, no relation to Omos, WWE's Nigerian giant. Homo sapiens rise up. It gives us a lot of his backstory, his childhood all the way back in the 1960s as he met the Doctor and fought against oil production in Edo State. It's a nice short read and lays a lot of the groundwork for Omo in this episode, especially since we get the basic cliff notes as one of the stories Omo is telling in this mysterious barbershop. But more on that stuff in a bit. I do like when the Doctor already has connections in the setting. It doesn't happen very often, but it's always nice to show how well travelled he is, that, like Andor, he has friends everywhere. Omo is a decent character in this story, this friendly barbershop owner that treats his clientele like family. But the episode does run into the same issue a lot of 15th Doctor episodes have had, in that those side characters don't feel established or fleshed out enough. Outside of a scene where they all explain their reasons for going into the barbershop before getting trapped, we really don't know anything about these characters, and they're pretty underdeveloped. But they work as extensions of the setting, which is one pretty new and interesting for Doctor Who. Doctor Who takes place all through space and time, but mainly Earth because of the familiarity of it all. We've seen Britain, France, Italy, Germany, Russia, Australia, the USA, China, even Antarctica. Doctor Who has visited all 7 continents, but it has barely visited Africa. Sure, we've had Egypt, and Egypt again, and briefly Madagascar in Praxeus, but that's literally it on TV. For the second biggest continent on Earth, Africa has been sorely misrepresented in Doctor Who. But The Story in the Engine changes that with its authentic Nigerian setting. Somewhere the 15th Doctor feels at home because he's treated no differently to regular humans. He's not judged for his skin colour like he now is in a lot of predominantly white nations, like Lux also implied he is. It's really nice to see how comfortable the Doctor is in the busy streets of Lagos, a setting I correctly predicted, by the way. You know, it genuinely feels like his home away from home. He's friends with everyone and just flows through the streets like a local. The setting feels so vibrant and real despite being a set built in Cardiff. I especially love the touch of Belinda having a much harder time navigating the exact same streets and the same crowd because she's not familiar with the setting. It's more of a culture shock, and it's just such a good contrast between how the exact same streets can be a completely different experience for each person that walks them. The setting also just naturally lends itself to Doctor Who. As writer Inua Ellams explains himself, Nigerians are very superstitious, and Doctor Who flirts with superstition, so it's just a really fitting location for the episode, and it really comes to life thanks to the writing and the production. The Doctor's experience of seeing the barbershop as a safe place is something that actually draws upon real experiences. Ellams wrote a play named The Barbershop Chronicles, which was obviously a big inspiration for this episode, and during an interview promoting it, he pointed out how for British black men, barbershops are somewhere they can freely exist and be welcomed without worrying about encountering or being harassed by the police. So it obviously shows how the Doctor's history and love for Omos's barbershop is rooted in genuine real life. It's really interesting to see. But this time, when the Doctor visits Omos's palace, things are a little different because it's full of missing people. It's just typical Doctor Who, a bunch of people getting trapped in such an innocuous barbershop setting. I love the atmosphere inside this shop. Not only does it look fantastic as a set, but the energy created through the acting and camera work gives it a much more sinister feeling. And of course, it gives us an intriguing mystery, because this shop is surrounded by signs warning people to stay away, since once you enter, you're trapped there by this magical door, sealing you inside a different dimension. So even when your hair is done, you're still stuck there. Like the best song ever, Hotel California, you can check out anytime you like, but you can never leave. It turns out Omos's palace is under new management, courtesy of the evil barber holding all these men hostage. Arion Bakari is absolutely fantastic as this villainous figure. He's a really sinister and unsettling presence. You can't help but hang on to his every word, and the barber is just such a great antagonist for this episode. The Doctor is immediately suspicious of him for very good reasons, but there's nothing he can really do since he's already trapped. The barber doesn't need to threaten these men to keep them scared, because it's implied they've been there long enough to have already tried everything. I feel like the barber could have easily been a Time Lord because of how well Bakari personifies the character with such ancient wisdom and sense of control. There's a real gravitas to his performance as this villain, especially with how well he is paired with Gatwa. They're such a natural fit for a face-off. It's interesting how this episode is a bit of a bottle episode, taking place almost exclusively inside this one barbershop, focusing on these character dynamics and how the barber keeps everyone under his thumb. Even Belinda doesn't show up much in this episode, spending the first half stuck inside the TARDIS like Amy in The Lodger. Of course, that is a shame considering she was barely even in the last episode too, but at least it's incorporated into the story here. Belinda growing more comfortable around the Doctor and allowing him to take this landing as an excursion for his own reasons, even if it eventually becomes an adventure. It's good to show her growing independence as a companion, how she goes after the Doctor to try and rescue him rather than just staying in the TARDIS the whole time. Sure, she doesn't get to do much when she's actually in there, but she's still present enough, and the Doctor's story allows her to be incorporated and fleshes out her backstory without her actually needing to be in the same room. Yes, as mentioned at the beginning, this episode is all about the kinds of stories told in a barbershop chair to pass the time, emphasising the trust we put in barbers and their skills to, not cut our head off. These men are trapped in Omos's palace and the barber is forcing them to constantly tell stories to fuel a machine. Their hair magically regrowing every time, like those GTA barbers that can give you more hair than when you walked in with. I could really do that, except, it's just bad genetic hairline. I'm not actually balding. I'll be this way in like 20 years, I promise. That's not copium. I really like the idea at the centre of this episode, weaponising that storytelling and perverting it into this kind of creative torture. The missing men running out of stories to tell and feeling the pressure more and more. After all, it's just a constant cycle of haircuts. You're bound to run out of stories eventually. It's great how the visuals of these stories appear on the window. They look really good, and obviously they help to break up the monologuing that makes up most of the episode. There is power in stories, and this episode explores that idea, using it as a literal power source, not unlike the Rings of Akaton, for example. I like how helpless the Doctor is when he first sits in the chair, realising the forces he's dealing with and feeling so trapped. It's a good way to increase the stakes and this sense of danger, because this barber is clearly a serious threat. I also appreciate the Doctor's feeling of betrayal that Omo wanted him to come and tell stories so that he and his clients could escape. It removes that sense of safety the Doctor associated with the shop. He feels almost sold out in a way because Omo has essentially used him as a bargaining chip without his consent. The Doctor's anger is really good and justified here, because yes, Omo was right that the Doctor can handle it better and he can tell more stories thanks to his long life and many travels, but it wasn't Omo's right to make that decision for him. The feeling of betrayal and broken trust is acted phenomenally by Gatwa, especially since we've been given this idea of their long friendship. And of course they do reconcile at the end, but it's nice mid-episode tension. But why does Brutus the Barber Beefcake need all these stories? Well, when the Doctor attempts to break out of the shop, we see that they're actually on top of this giant mechanical spider on an electrical web thing in some sort of pocket dimension. This web is the Nexus, because you're either Nexus or against us. The Nexus looks absolutely fantastic visually, this vast web, and the idea behind it is very solid too, especially the concept of the barbershop being in two places at once, very TARDIS-like in that sense. The Nexus is similar to the Land of Fiction and how it's the barber's creation, where stories live and travel through time. He wants to control it and become the ruler of all these stories. He's piloting the spider machine to the heart of the Nexus to take control like this, and I appreciate that the story didn't go down the obvious route of being linked to AI generation. It would have been way too easy to have the Nexus stealing stories to generate its own, like feeding a database of books into an AI so it can spit out pair limitations that claim to be original. Thank God they didn't do that predictable narrative. However, what the Nexus is and how it actually works is kind of over-explained to the point of actually being a bit vague and confusing. It's basically like a brain of stories, again like the Mind Robber. It almost represents the art of storytelling itself, how stories grow and change, evolving as people pass them on. Early storytelling was entirely verbal, leading to intricate webs like this, stories branching off from the same route and becoming entirely different tales or mythologies because different people were spreading them and they changed over time. It's no surprise that the Nexus no longer needs the barber, its creator, to be able to function, because those stories are now in the hands of everyone. Nobody can control the ability to tell a story. I've said it before and I'll say it again, but stories are the foundation of existence itself. I consider it to be sort of a faith of its own, like I talked about ages ago in my God Complex review, because everything is a story. Just like the Doctor's short story about being born and then dying. That's a narrative. Everything you look at has a beginning and an end, even the universe itself. And stories are how we have gods, the same gods the barber is pretending to be. Indeed, this era of Doctor Who has been all about gods and the so-called pantheon. We've had the Toymaker, Maestro, Sutekh and Lux, so initially it seems to make a bit of sense that the Barber is the god of stories, because it's what we've been trained to expect from these episodes. But then the Doctor confronts the Barber for hiding his true face, only for the villain to reveal his identity as Anansi, Saga, Bastet, Dionysus. But then the Doctor confronts the Barber for hiding his true face, only for the villain to reveal his identity as Anansi, Saga, Bastet, Dionysus, and Loki, story lords, gods of lies and narratives. Again, it's literally what we've been trained and conditioned to expect, because of how this era plays with gods. And that's why it's so interesting and brilliant that the Doctor and Belinda just laugh in his face after his big speech, because they actually know the gods. The Doctor has first-hand friendly experiences of, going down to the pub and playing darts with these individual gods, and he knows that the Barber isn't any of them, causing this great, intimidating villain to shrink in fear and become so small under the Doctor's withering glare. Because, yes, the Barber isn't any of these gods. He's not a god at all. He's simply a messenger that told their stories and gave them power. He wasn't a harbinger for them, which is an important distinction, I think. I don't know, it's kind of confusing and vague about which gods are which because of all the pantheon stuff. But instead, he was essentially someone that brought them to life by telling and spreading their stories. He made it possible for people to worship these gods. But then, in a twist of mythological proportions, the gods didn't need him anymore. They cut him out of the deal once he built the Nexus. And that's his motivation. Revenge. He wants to kill the gods that he once made powerful to begin with, which is an interesting idea. A false god that wants to usurp the real ones and take their place in the center of the Nexus. After so many real gods, it was about time to see a false one to shake things up a bit. Yes, even though the Barber is a fake, his accomplice Abby isn't, with the reveal that she's actually Abena, the daughter of Anansi, who the Doctor apparently won in a bet back when he was the Fugitive Doctor, who makes a surprise 5-second cameo in this episode in a cool transition. Though it is a bit of a weird plot hole that he suddenly remembers being the Fugitive Doctor, when the whole point of that incarnation was the Doctor not remembering her because of the Division mind wipes, and only getting bits and pieces of information during the Flux incident because of Swarm and Azure. At the end of that arc, the Doctor chose to forego her chance at getting all of these memories back. So it's weird that now the 15th Doctor suddenly has all the memories of meeting Abena before, even if he does have to think pretty hard to recall them, it doesn't come instantly. I do like the tension between Abena and the Doctor though, since she feels abandoned by him. She could have become a companion, but this Time Lord didn't take her and she took it personally, so she still harbours this grudge even after all these years. It creates an interesting dynamic, although it's wrapped up pretty quickly as she soon decides to help the Doctor after a little pep talk by Belinda, who remembers to exist. Abena decides to tell a story this time, and I appreciate how her story is about slaves braiding their hair into maps to help each other escape plantations. Not only is it a really interesting educational story, but it also ties into her relation to Anansi, whose story began in Ghana as mythology before spreading to the Americas through the slave trade, becoming a symbol of resistance against oppression and slavery because of how Anansi uses cunning and trickery to outsmart them, much like we see with this braiding plan. It's a really smart use of Abena as Anansi's daughter, who is presumably based on Anansawa, the character created by playwright Effa Sutherland. It's a really solid moment of defiance that also drives the plot forward because she covertly gives the Doctor the route to the middle of the engine. So it's just a lot of things being incorporated together very well. The Doctor and Belinda then find themselves in the engine room of the engine, filled with trinkets, almost like the Doctor's own TARDIS in Journey to the Centre of the TARDIS. The visual of the story engine is pretty cool, this giant brain structure that unfolds like a tree, further emphasising these ideas of stories branching off like roots. But this really does give me such mind robber vibes because of the master brain in that story, which fed on the power of writers it enslaved, needing stories to survive. But I guess the engine here is kind of the reverse, since the Barber created it and it simply uses story as fuel. And in typical Doctor Who fashion, the Doctor decides to overload it with too much sauce, turning on iPlayer and playing every Doctor Who episode ever, since he has infinite stories. We even get an 8th Doctor cameo. Hell yeah! Hashtag McGann Gang. It's not quite explained how the Doctor manages to suddenly control the engine, but it is still a cool moment. One of those climaxes that draws upon the history of the show in a novel way, showing the sheer length of his life and his experiences. He has so many stories, too many stories for this machine to cope with. It can't process it all, so obviously it starts to break down and explode. It's a predictable yet fitting ending for the crisis. A simple overfeeding like we've seen before multiple times, but it works well for what it is. And of course, it is just another excuse for them to show us things and people we recognise for that classic dopamine hit. Just like the dopamine hit from you hitting that like and subscribe. With the engine overloading, the Doctor is able to talk the Barber into letting everyone go. So it's just these two characters left in the compressing shop as everything is exploding. It's very in character for the Doctor to still want to save the Barber even after everything he's done. He's just that compassionate. But I think they missed a trick here when he's asking the Barber what his 6-word story would be, and to not let this be the end of his story. With how they show the Barber to be so emotional at this, I feel like they could have had him reveal that he's become so used to listening and parroting other people's stories and printing the stories of the gods in books that he's forgotten how to tell and write his own stories. Not in like the AI analogy way, just a general character motivation way. That would have just added a little extra wrinkle of character depth right there at the end, a crisis of confidence of sorts. Like he says at the very end, he spent his entire existence serving the gods and collecting stories. I just think it might have been that extra oomph to his character to make his second chance at life work all the more. Instead, Omo gives the Barber his shop as an act of forgiveness and kindness, and it's all a very neat ending with a lot of dialogue to try and wrap up all these strands. Everyone goes their own way, and I do appreciate that even though Abena forgives the Barber, she doesn't stay with him or become his assistant now that he's got a job. She has her own journey to take, which is a nice message about being able to forgive someone without completely absolving them of what they did. Oh, and then the episode ends with a reminder that Belinda randomly saw Captain Poppy from Space Babies, which is a really weird moment they seem to have incorporated purposefully as a hint to something for the wider story arc. Who knows how that's even going to make any sense. One of the main things Doctor Who fans have been asking for a long time now is for new creative writers to bring new creative ideas to the show. And that's exactly what A New Elms does with the story and the engine. It's an episode that sends us to a sorely underrepresented area of the world for this story, emphasising the importance of community within places like barbershops, where people trade stories and can just be themselves. It's a bit of a bottle episode taking place almost entirely in this one barbershop, so it's pretty dialogue heavy, but I think that works in its favour because of this focus on telling stories. And I think the animations help to diversify it a bit by giving us some interesting visuals alongside all this dialogue. The villainous Barber is a fantastic antagonist brought to life so effectively, and I love the gimmick of him trapping these people inside the shop to force them into telling stories to fuel this engine so we can get revenge on the storytelling gods. It's a brilliant premise for the episode, and it proves how creative and interesting Doctor Who can be when you put it in new hands like this. Of course, there are some flaws throughout, like the continued weak characterization of side characters, the villain motivations and abilities being a bit over-explained, and it took me a second watch to actually understand it all, but the setting is so rich and the episode's atmosphere is so gripping, so I feel like it easily deserves a B grade. It continues the season's brilliant consistency, and it's prime Doctor Who with a mix of everything like emotion, tension, educational storytelling, jokes, world building, just a bit of everything the show prides itself on. And of course, Paul McGann. It's a great episode of Doctor Who that isn't perfect, but incredibly enjoyable, and proof that the show doesn't have to constantly play to nostalgia or cheap tricks to be interesting and compelling. But what do you think of the story in the engine? Did it work for you? Did it fall flat? Let me know in the comments, and also, did you get a hard bingo this week? Come on, Duncan. This week has got to be the week. We were so close last time. Did you get it?
Yippee! Ooh, that's a bingo!
And on that note, thank you all very much for watching, and as always, I'll see you in the next one. Bye bye. And I'd just like to give a special thank you to my Asbantium level patrons, Chris Douglas, Fallon Cortez, and Jamie Ashton, my Platinum level patron, Matthew Burns, and all my Gold level patrons, Ben Salmon, Daniel Shilato, James Alea Waterhouse, and Seb Falco. Thank you so much for your support.